"Congratulations on your marriage," I said, trying to sound polite, but his response was as cutting as ever. "Can you leave quickly after dropping off some cash? It's unpleasant being around someone disabled." I'm a working professional who has been married for a few years. Shortly after my wedding, I was in a car accident that left me unable to use my legs. Ever since, I've relied on a wheelchair to get around, though I attend rehabilitation sessions every week in hopes of recovery. When I first found out I'd be confined to a wheelchair, I was devastated, but my wife, her parents, and my family have been nothing but supportive. Their kindness has kept me positive, even when the rehabilitation process is hard. Thankfully, since I work from home, I've been able to manage life relatively well, despite the circumstances. However, there's one person who has made things difficult: my brother-in-law. Outwardly, he's the picture of a successful, well-liked man. When I first met him at my in-laws' house, I thought he seemed nice, but when he learned I had been in an accident and was now in a wheelchair, his true colors began to show. "The worst part is that my brother-in-law is disabled. Don't make things harder for the family," he said coldly, as though my accident was an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. It was an odd and hurtful thing to say to someone who had just endured such a life-changing event. His attitude only worsened. During a visit to my in-laws, he told me, "Could you not leave the wheelchair here? It's in the way. Leave it outside when you come into the house." I was already exhausted mentally and emotionally, and his comments only made it harder. What made it worse was how he only said these things when we were alone, never in front of my wife or her parents. His behavior was sneaky and deliberately cruel. Despite how much his comments bothered me, I tried to brush them off, thinking maybe he was just struggling with how my disability might affect the family. But his sarcasm and dismissive attitude never stopped, each encounter more draining than the last. Then, he decided to get married, as if life for him would just carry on perfectly. His bride was the daughter of the president of the company where my brother-in-law worked. He had impressed the president enough that the man asked him to marry his daughter. We gave our blessing to the marriage, not because of her status, but because it was his choice. As the wedding preparations progressed, we eventually received the invitation. I marked attending and sent it back, knowing how excited everyone was for this big event. The wedding was held at a famous hotel, and it was an extravagant affair, as expected for the daughter of a company president. The guest list was long, and it was clear a great deal of money had been spent to make it a grand occasion. When we arrived, my wife needed to use the restroom, so I waited in the corner of the ceremony hall, taking in the splendor of the decorations and the bustle of the guests. Suddenly, I heard a familiar voice behind me, my brother-in-law's. "The worst thing you can do is marry an ugly woman," he said, laughing with his friends, "but I'm putting up with it because she's the boss's daughter. Marrying into a rich family? I'm going to be living the high life. I can handle an unattractive wife if it means living happily ever after." I stood there, stunned, listening as my brother-in-law and his friends gossiped about the bride. The cruelty in his words was shocking, and I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. Here he was, talking so casually about the woman he was about to marry, reducing her worth to her looks and her family's wealth. After a while, my brother-in-law left to rejoin the festivities. I returned to my wife, who was glowing with happiness for her brother. I debated telling her what I had overheard but decided against it. She was too thrilled about the wedding, and I couldn't bring myself to shatter her joy, so I remained silent, keeping the cruel words to myself as we headed to the groom's waiting room, where my brother-in-law and the rest of the family were already gathered. When I arrived, I greeted him warmly. "Congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you for coming," he replied with a smile, so polite and charming that it was hard to believe he was the same person I'd overheard gossiping about his bride earlier. "I'd like to speak with him alone," my brother-in-law suddenly said, turning to the others. "You two can go to the waiting room and relax." He led me down an empty hallway, his demeanor shifting the moment we were alone. Once he was sure no one was around, his expression turned cold. "What are you doing here?" he sneered. "Having a handicapped person in my family is disgraceful." His voice was as venomous as when he had spoken about the bride. "Just go home after you've paid your share for the celebration. The bride's family doesn't need a disabled person here, it's inconvenient for them." I was stunned. I had come to congratulate him on his wedding, yet here I was, being insulted and dismissed. His words filled me with anger, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. Was my presence, in a wheelchair, truly an inconvenience for everyone? Feeling humiliated, I decided to leave, just as he suggested. "I'll make an excuse to my sister," I said quietly. My brother-in-law chuckled mockingly as I walked away, his laughter echoing in the empty hall. As I made my way home, my phone rang. It was my wife, her voice filled with panic. "Where are you? I realized you were gone and I got worried." I hesitated but replied, "I'm heading home. I didn't want to cause any trouble." "Who said that to you?" she asked, her voice rising with concern. "Nobody said anything like that, and if anyone does, I'll be the first to stand up for you." Her words brought me so much comfort. She was furious, as if she had been insulted herself. Buoyed by her support, I turned around and headed back to the wedding. When I returned, my wife rushed up to me, relief and love written all over her face. My in-laws were relieved when they saw me return, but my brother-in-law wasn't happy at all. "Why did you come back? I told you disabled people are a burden," he shouted angrily. "People in wheelchairs are garbage. Get out." My wife immediately snapped back, telling him to stop calling me names, but he wouldn't listen. "I've already said people like him aren't welcome here. His presence bothers me," he continued, making cruel comments about me. A guest overheard the argument and approached us, drawing attention from others. Soon, there was a commotion in the ceremony hall. The bride and her father noticed something was wrong and came over. Despite the growing scene, my brother-in-law didn't stop insulting me. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled out my phone and played a recording for everyone to hear. It was his voice, saying, "The worst thing you can do is marry an ugly woman, but since she's the boss's daughter, I'll put up with it." My brother-in-law turned pale, clearly agitated. "This recording is fake," he stammered, trying to make excuses, but I ignored him and kept playing the audio. The recording continued with him saying, "I'm going to be rich, I can live the high life, even if I have to marry someone unattractive." His face turned bright red as the guests murmured in shock. The audio had captured his conversation with his friends before the ceremony, where they talked without realizing they were being recorded. Realizing he was caught, my brother-in-law tried to lunge at me, but someone else stepped in first, the father of the bride. The bride's father stood in front of my brother-in-law, silently pressuring him to stop. My brother-in-law, desperate, tried to explain, "Mr. President, I'm sorry, but there's more to this. This disabled person is trying to set me up." But the bride's father remained calm and quietly said, "The bride's late mother was born with a disability." The room went silent. My brother-in-law had no more excuses. She had spent her entire life in a wheelchair. The bride's father explained that he wanted to start a business where people with physical disabilities, like his wife, could work comfortably. He made it clear that someone with my brother-in-law's mindset wasn't welcome in his company. Hearing this, my brother-in-law panicked. "It's not my fault, it's all his fault," he stammered, trying to shift the blame onto me. Desperate, he attempted to make peace with the bride's father, but his excuses fell flat. The bride was shocked to discover that her fiancé had only been interested in her for money. However, she remained calm and announced that she would cancel the wedding and end the engagement. In a panic, my brother-in-law tried to approach her, but her father blocked him. The bride and her father apologized to the guests, and the ceremony was officially cancelled. My brother-in-law collapsed to the ground in despair, unable to rise. As the guests left, many gave him and his friends cold, disapproving looks. Offended by his cruel remarks, the bride calmly stated that she would seek compensation for the broken engagement. The wedding and engagement were annulled, and everyone was informed of the true reason behind the cancellation. The bride's father, being a well-respected and powerful figure in the community, fired my brother-in-law from his company. My brother-in-law tried to find work elsewhere, but no one would hire him, fearing the influence of the bride's father. He even reached out to friends for help, but they all distanced themselves from him. With no other options, my brother-in-law eventually left town, working tirelessly to pay off the wedding expenses and compensation in a faraway place. Tragically, he was involved in a car accident that left him disabled, a bitter irony, given how he had mocked people with disabilities. As for me, I was finally able to walk again, thanks to my wife's unwavering support and the hard work I put into rehabilitation. These days, my favorite thing to do is spend weekends shopping with my wife, trying to repay her for all the love and care she gave me during my toughest times. Thank you for reading my story.